So welcome to our discussion on Wilhelm Reich, and we're going to talk a lot. I always said to keep it to an hour. I know it's going to be longer than an hour. It's going to be about an hour and a half. We're still not going to fit in all the super interesting things that we would like to, but it'll be a fabulous journey through the beginning of the understanding of Reich, or even if you know him and are familiar with what his work was about, it'll be a really interesting expansion on all of it. So. Um, as people are coming on, we had a really full call. So I know that we're just at the kind of the beginning of people coming on. I would love to know, first of all, where you're calling in from. That's always fun to know. And if you know, if you know anything about Reich, just do a yes or a no. Like, you know, if you've only just heard of him, say no. But if you have any kind of knowledge of him, say yes, just so that we have an idea. And if you can drop that in the chat, that would be really great. So that the team and I are familiar. Largo, Florida, welcome. And Denmark and Buenos Aires and Scotland and Sweden. A little bit. No. Okay, great. No, Australia. It's really helpful to kind of know how we want to gear the talk. So please do just drop it in. Costa Rica, yes. Yes, a little in Utah. Ottawa, Canada, no. Austin, no. Okay. Yeah, keep them coming in so that we're familiar with that. Also, feel free to drop in any kind of questions that you might have that really stand out for you that you want us to cover. It can easily be integrative once we get through the kind of information that we want to share. Santa Maria, California, yes. BC, great. Oakland, probably. Winnipeg, Birmingham, great. And do drop in your questions. Great. So a lot of people are familiar already with Reich. So I'm going to just go ahead and introduce who we're here with. We have Håvard Friis Nielsen, who is a historian and a professor of social sciences in Oslo. Do you want to just come on and say hi, Håvard?
For inviting me.
Yeah.
There you
Hi.
are.
He's just written a book in Norway that has had some rave reviews and a lot of coverage, and so we're going to talk about that. And we also have David Silver, who is the executive director of the Wilhelm Reich Infant Trust and the museum, where he is right now in the museum. There's visitors coming by the museum at the moment. You want to say hi, David?
Hello, everyone from Rangeley, Maine.
Wonderful. I'm just closing off some windows over here. Beautiful. Okay. So this, I'm going to start because some people are familiar and other people are not familiar with Reich. I wanted to start off by asking both of our other guests what they say when somebody says, "Who is Wilhelm Reich?" So Håvard, would you like to lead with that?
So Reich was a medical doctor from Austria, from Vienna, and a pupil of Sigmund Freud. So from the 1920s to the mid-30s, he was one of the most prolific psychoanalysts. He was very prolific in writing articles, papers, and books, and he was particularly interested in, his main topic was emotional resistance and defenses in therapy. And he eventually came to be interested in the connection between the psyche and the body. So he saw that our defenses is usually muscular in type. So he coined this concept of a muscular armor. So in a sense, he was the father of body psychotherapy, increasingly interested in how the defenses manifest themselves in the body. So he took psychoanalysis in a more corporeal direction. And he was politically active in the 1930s. So he was an active against the growing fascism of the time. So he was also the only psychoanalyst at the time in 1933, the same year as Hitler seized power in Germany, who wrote a psychoanalytic treatise on fascism called The Mass Psychology of Fascism.
Which is a great book.
So, and he had to flee from country to country because he was persecuted, really, and went from Austria to Germany, and from, well, not because of persecution then, but he escaped from Germany in 1933 and went first to Denmark and then to Norway, and finally to the United States. And he was good at gathering a huge following wherever he went, and he was an extremely energetic man who built up publishing houses and journals and as outlet for his writings and for his colleagues' writings. And but he ended up in a prison cell and died of a heart attack in a prison cell in the United States. So I'm sure we can speak more about that.
Yeah,
but
there's a lot of
he was a controversial man, but he's also been a very influential man, influential psychiatrist, and also his views on energy in general was has sort of suffused popular culture as well. So people from John Lennon to Kate Bush to Sean Connery have been really interested in Reich, and written songs, or written books about him. So he's
and
he's a fascinating character of the 20th century.
And there's a lot of, there is the controversy. I would like to remember to go back to that too. So we might end up there because that's quite a story. The American government burnt Reich's books. So the only person's books who were ever burned by the American government. And you would have
But
to
of
wonder
course, Freud too was controversial in a sense, and Freud's works and Reich's works were burnt on in Berlin, in Germany, and in a sense, both Freud and Reich, the early psychoanalysts were, in a sense, the first sexologists before we had any concept of sexology. So sexuality was a main concept in their theories, and that was controversial in itself.
And that's also where Freud and Reich actually divided in ideas around the libido theory too.
I'm not so sure about that, but we can discuss that.
We can dig in. Okay,
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. That was really good. David, what would you say? Would you add anything to that, or what's your particular take? And what
well,
Howard
covered, I think Howard covered the overview very, very well. And if I would try to think of something to add, besides being very prolific and very energetic and controversial, Reich, he studied humanity in nature. He wasn't concerned with social norms so much. In fact, he studied the social aspect of humanity the same way that he studied the somatic and the psychological aspects of humanity. And so he invited a lot of controversy by triggering reactions in people, by being very blunt in his studies of sex and his studies of, things like mass psychology and the ways in which sexual suppression, is sort of entrenched within culture and does damage, to people, which then has implications for child rearing and things like that. So he wasn't someone who pulled punches or ever worried about how his views would be perceived. He was very straightforward, and that attracted a lot of people to him, but it also made a lot of people enemies. And that happened in the United States during the McCarthy era, when he became a kind of a natural target for people who didn't really understand him, and succumbed to rumor and distortion and, you know, sort of innuendo about his work. And I hope we do go into the reason why he was imprisoned and why the books were burned, because it's complicated, and it's really just a kind of a bizarre, tragic sequence of events that were unpredictable at the time, and kind of unique. So, and then I guess I could add.
Yeah, sorry to.
And then I could add to.
Yeah.
No, go ahead, make your comment. I can follow up later.
No, you go ahead, and I'll move on after you.
Well, just he did have a profound influence on popular culture, especially after his death. He became a kind of a hero of the counterculture, rightly or sometimes even was misunderstood, but still became a hero. You know, he was identified with some kind of sexual liberation and, you know, things like that might have been a bit misconstrued. But many writers, you know, William Burroughs and Saul Bellow and Norman Mailer, and, you know, many writers were influenced by him, musicians, as Howard talked about. And you know, he invented the orgone accumulator, which is an actually very interesting device with a lot of anecdotal evidence to recommend it. People order the plans to build an orgone accumulator from our website from somewhere in the world practically every day of the year, which is kind of strange for something that a so-called pseudoscientific quack invented 80 years ago.
And that put him in jail and
right.
Had all his books burned. Yeah.
And that the Food and Drug Administration. Now, when we go into the, you know, all his books weren't burned. Books that the Food and Drug Administration considered to be kind of labeling or advertising or, you know, connected with promoting this device, this orgone accumulator device. That's what was destroyed or withheld from the market. But we can talk about that later if we get to it. But so the orgone accumulator, and I would just add to what Howard said, that during the last, let's say, decade and a half of his life, he focused much more on natural scientific research, on the functioning of the same energy that he thought he was working with clinically with psychoanalytic patients and with vegetotherapeutic patients, as you know, the same energy he felt was present everywhere, and its properties gave rise to you know, sort of the whole many aspects of creation, of how things evolve in nature, how nature organizes itself. And he called this energy orgone, but that's just a name. It's, you know, he acknowledged it's the same energy that Eastern traditions might call chi, or, you know, others, prana, different names. But he felt that he was studying it from a kind of a more quantitative perspective, and that consumed a lot of his attention for the latter part of his life, and attracted criticism because he seemed to be moving across vastly different disciplines where you know, where it wasn't clear where his expertise would have come from, you know, from physics to cosmology and to atmospheric research and things like that. So it's a big story.
And we're gonna talk about how he could be in so many different areas too, in relation to being a pattern thinker, and where fractals come in, which are also in physics. But please, Hovar, go ahead. Thanks, David.
I was thinking about this trait of his, that he seemed to gain followers and also enemies, and some of his followers turned into enemies in his life, and
some enemies turned into followers too, right?
Yeah, not that often, but sometimes. But Norway's first professor of psychology, Harald Schjelderup, was the one who invited Reich to Norway, and he said that he was a genius in starting a psychoanalytic therapy, that he had never seen any psychoanalyst who was as good as Reich in starting the therapeutic process. And I think what he meant was when a psychoanalyst works with a patient, he or she, they kind of work with the transference relations, that the patient will develop a bond to the therapist, which oftentimes are first very positive and can then turn into a negative reaction. And I think Reich was very skilled in creating such transference bonds. This was what he was working with. And he often tried to provoke the negative underlying reactions in a patient. So he really wanted to get under the positive and trigger the negative reaction, and then move on to a more neutral and a calmer territory in the therapy sessions. But I think he kind of never stopped working with these forces in his daily life as well, so that he always was on and developed transference relations with everyone around him.
Mm-hmm. And what got you first interested in his work? Why you just wrote a book? We're going to talk about your book. But I'm just curious why you were interested in Reich. How did that start?
Yes, actually, I wasn't. So I was part of a research group at the University of Oslo who was writing the history of the university. And I was writing about Harald Schjelderup, our first professor of psychology, and I had no clue who Wilhelm Reich was. But when I started digging into the material, I saw that Reich came to Norway on Schjelderup's invitation, and he was wow, I need to learn more about this, I thought. And it is just, at that time, this is over 20 years ago, there wasn't that much material available online or anywhere that really, there were no really serious works about Reich. And that fascinated me too, when I discovered how central he had been in the psychoanalytic circuit and how close he had been to Freud. So the whole story got more interesting to me. And so I got to learn more about Reich than I had expected.
Mm-hmm. And that's where I met both of you. It was, of course, at the conferences that happen every year in Rangeley or online. This year, the conference is online. But I've been to, I think, 4 conferences now, 3, if not 4, with the both of you. And Håvard, so you just wrote a book. You got enough down the rabbit hole of Reichian things that you just wrote a book that I will say has been extremely well received. You know, for somebody who has a lot of controversy around him, there's always, I've noticed in the academic field, I'm not the academic, but all of, many people who come to the conference are, and I've noticed a hesitation somewhere. It's like fascinated in this man, but you also kind of want to keep it a little bit on the side because of the reputation that Reich had, because of all the controversy.
There's a lot of, yes.
Yeah. And so you ended up being extremely well received. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about that because I know you won't talk about it yourself as much. But you spoke at the Academy of Sciences and several houses of literature. You really had a quite your 15 minutes of fame in Norway specifically, but also in other places. And even at the Holocaust Museum on a Sunday when they expected less than 70 people, over 300 people showed up as example. So you've been at the Academy of Sciences. There's kind of been this big revival, and you've been very busy for the last year and a half with this kind of overwhelming interest, and you being in the center of that. So I wanted to give you kudos for all your hard work, because I know that.
Thank you. It's in Norwegian, of course, but here it is. It's kind of a beast of a book. And
what does tell about the title, what it means? And
it's called "You Must Not Sleep: Wilhelm Reich and the History of Psychoanalysis." And "You Must Not Sleep" is a very famous poem in Norway, written by a poet who went in therapy with Reich at the time. And and that particular poem, which most Norwegians know almost by heart, was written during the therapy. So, and he said it came up like a stream from the unconscious. Well, it's true. The book was very well received. It was shortlisted as one of the 10 best books of the year by the major newspaper here, which is not to brag, but it's to say that it was a major relief for me that finally a book about such a controversial figure could be taken seriously. And I'm not sort of trying to portray him very one-sided as some kind of a hero, but so there's light and shadow and darkness in here, and as well also in his personality. But I think it's such a hugely interesting body of work that he has left behind. So it's really sad the way it's not being taken, hasn't been taken seriously, really. But it's a legacy that can be. There's plenty of rich, valuable material there.
And why do you think his contribution and his work are relevant today and should be given some credence today?
I think that many of the ideas that he was the first to propagate, like the importance of the body and the muscles and our defenses in psychological, the connection between psyche and soma. I mean, we take that for granted today. That was controversial at the time. So, and also the energetic way of looking, the energetic medicine, in a way, Reich was interested in psychosomatic medicine. And that was a concept that they didn't have at the time. And today we take that kind of for granted too. I mean, it's nothing controversial in that.
Well,
but
there's
he
a
was
lot
one of the first to
controversial in it,
explore.
actually.
Pardon?
Yeah. No, it's still very controversial in a lot
Okay,
of
maybe it
ways.
is. Well, but
Yeah. Yeah, no, which is why, I mean, I'll actually just share a little bit about why I got interested in Reich in the first place. And when I was in my early 20s, I read one of his primary works, The Function of the Orgasm. And I, because I was raised since in utero, my mother was stretching and she had been a famous dancer in Canada and she got pregnant with me. So she was stretching, trying to reconstruct her body and developed a whole technique around postural alignment. We call it somatic stretch. I run the training program. This has kind of been a family lineage from my grandfather to my mother to me. So I grew up with the understanding of there being mind-body connection in a time when that was more acceptable. But I remember, I think I was 20 or 21 when I read that book, and I read the word sexologist, which you brought up earlier, which we should dive into a little bit more too, given time, if somebody could write that down to go back to of really what that means. And I just know that I didn't know what it meant, but I literally put the book on my chest and I was like, wow, like, what is a sex? I think I am one. Like, I didn't even know what it meant. So for me, I know that I mean, even going into, where does sexuality come in with Reich? And really, we're talking about life force energy. And I find it fascinating and always have that we separate life force energy from the orgasm that starts life in the human body. And you would think that, my running joke is that, life starts with an orgasm, hopefully two, but at least one. And at the same time, we push this over to the side, and you would think that if we really wanted to know the origin of life, that there would be a center of the study of orgasm in every city, but that's far from the truth. And when we're talking about life energy in the body, not being just a genital something happenstance that happens, but it's literally in every cell and creating everything. Reich really brought forward the idea that you can't really discount the two separately. This is how I see Reich. This is what drew me to Reichian concepts. He started really looking at like, what is sexual energy in relation to our world, to the connection between the mind and the body. You can't make it something separate. And I've never really been comfortable with or understood how we could take sexuality and such a large, powerful concept like moth to flame, we're drawn to it. But I remember coming into my own sexuality when I was younger and later reflecting back and feeling like it was a currency before I even knew what to do with it. You know, it wasn't a currency from an energetic level. It was a way that we trade and barter and manipulate and do all of these things that are, you know, seemingly subconscious. And yet they are the engine of how we're living. They are the engine of how we're animating ourselves and talking. This is how the mind and the body connect. And so not only was he really the kind of the founding father of psychodynamic work of understanding how the mind and the emotions get locked in the body in a certain way and how that can lead to neurosis. And he was dealing with patients with high neurosis. And that really started the kind of the whole ball rolling of understanding the depth to the conversation. And then once you're talking about sexual energy and the armoring, the character armoring that he talks about in the body, and you're looking at the repression of energies in the body and how they manifest in a family, in a community, in the world, within politics, within fascism, in the mass psychology of fascism. There wasn't a big distinction between sex is over here and how we run the world is over here, but that the repression of energies, and he focused in many ways on the sexuality and the energy that he called orgone, just to try to quantify it scientifically. This all became very fascinating to me. And so that's where he really starts to see where there are so many different patterns where energies run in all things. And one of my favorite lines that I read many years ago was that he said, if I ever learned anything, it was just this. And that is the whole orgasm formula that he talks about tension and charge and then discharge and then relaxation, and that everything moves like this. And that is the fundamental pattern to all living things. And this is something that you can see that's why he would be able to look at the environment, but and I'm actually going to, David, what are all of or either one of you, all of the areas, let's just go through the different areas that Reich is known to have studied and shared research in, just to prove that point. Drop them in.
Well, there's the clinical work with subjects, but then there was also looking to kind of quantify whether there was something. Well, he knew there was something physical happening underlying what people experienced. So he did the bioelectrical experiments where he attached electrodes and measured galvanic skin response, measured electrical movement of energy during pleasure and anxiety and things like this, only it wasn't exactly electricity he was measuring. He felt he was measuring this orgone. And then further study led him to want to see this in single-celled organisms. And so he started studying amoeba. And when they told him, because he had trained as an MD and he had laboratory skills, but he was not a microbiologist. So when he wanted to study amoeba, they said, well, you just put some grass in a test tube and amoeba will form from spores. Well, he looked at this very, very closely and then began studying. He saw things that people hadn't talked about, and he started studying origin of life and the disintegration of plant material into clumps of pre-living organisms, objects that he called bions, that he watched sort of pulsate and form together and grow, into what looked like living organisms. This led him to studying cancer, and ultimately he went on to study the same processes in nature, in the way the atmosphere can become stagnant and break down, in a manner that he found was sort of similar to what might happen in a human organism when cancer develops. So he had some theories that went across boundaries of disciplines by finding some what he called common functioning principles that were
why he, I think one of the reasons why he delved into so many different areas was partly that he was invited to lecture and do research at the University of Oslo when he came to Norway in 1934. And with his collaboration with a professor of psychology at the time, I think they both wanted to find some almost positivist confirmation of psychoanalytic theories. So they tried to do measurement, like the skin experiments with the measurements of the galvanic responses. That was one way of confirming psychoanalytic theories about sexuality and anxiety that nobody had ever done before. So that was creative and bold. But of course, and his research into cancer was partly because Freud was dying of cancer, and he wanted to explore the cancer problem as a medical doctor. And here again, this psychosomatic thinking comes in, where he thinks that maybe cancer is resulting from psychological or emotional issues, and or even sexual issues, especially when cancer develops in the sexual organs, like the breasts or the prostate. And so he was thinking, let's get the emotions and the psyche into these diseases, into our understanding of them. But of course, his crossing of boundaries, of disciplinary boundaries, didn't do him much good. He became increasingly scientifically isolated, and it was easy to dismiss him. And of course, he made mistakes too. So it's a complicated story.
I think I wanted to just a couple comments on a whole bunch of things that have been stated. One, that I think the acceptance of Hovard's book sort of demonstrates that there is an even though Reich became a kind of a controversial figure who was frequently written out of the history of the fields where he was the most influential, the awakening that's happening demonstrates that there really is a lot of common ground where people agree on the importance of Reich's contributions. And we have to remember that he talked about emotional resignation as having something to do with illness at a time when that was considered a crazy idea. Mm-hmm. And I also want to mention, Reich was often singled out for having some kind of obsession with sex and sexual functioning, when I think actually the opposite was true. It was the people who were making the accusation. Yeah. You see, Reich was looking for what is the fuel that drives human emotion and that drives life itself. Well, it's this life energy. Mm-hmm. And when he studied the illnesses that arose in human beings, he found that the blocking of life energy and the inability to let it flow freely, to let it build up and release fully, was actually kind of a definition of disease, was literally the definition of what neurosis was, what the abstract concepts that the psychoanalysts were talking about really was. And there was no split between psyche and soma for Reich. There's a unity. Mm-hmm. He was completely holistic about it. So when he came to these understandings through observation and work with patients, he found that the inability to let energy flow and to fully discharge energy, well, that is equal to a disturbance in sexual functioning.
And that's connected too, but not solely. And this is where it gets so interesting. And I do want to, are you finished? Because I wanted to add to that.
Well, you can take over.
No, when we talk about cancer, let's go to a more extreme illness, for instance. One thing that we know about cancer, but that's not actually really commonly discussed, is that when tissue falls beneath 60% of oxygen levels, that's when cancer begins to develop. And so if we look at the idea of emotions causing a response in the body, for instance, when someone's angry when they walk in a room, whether you ask them about it or even see their face, their body holds the way they do, the way that we're open, the way that we're closed. So our body is this physiological expression of a psychological state of mind. And if we start contracting and holding things, and these happen from the inside out, it's not just holding your shoulder. It's something that's kind of seeped out to the actual exterior part of our musculature through our nerves, which is our brain and our whole body. And as we start to contract and reduce flow right? We can talk about it esoterically as some energy flowing through the body, or we can just talk about blood flow. And in Chinese medicine, qi or energy and blood are on a continuum. They completely work together. So if we're restricting blood flow, we're reducing important vital nutrients into areas of the body, and we're reducing oxygen levels. And so I think that's a very interesting link in itself of where cancer and emotions can actually be seen to interplay. Now, where it gets difficult is when we simplify it too much, like, oh, you must have cancer because you have, anger at your family, whatever it is. I mean, we can't simplify it too much, but Reich was really, really invested in being able to actually find the scientific progression. And as we've been saying, was really the first to do that. So I feel that his work is so prevalent today because we have not cracked that code. We're still putting, sex over here with, in the box it's supposed to be in, and using it more like, a drug through porn, as opposed to something that is really actually connected to, a small emotion up here being connected to the source of sexual energy down here. Well, you can't run a radio without the battery there, but that doesn't mean that the voice or the red light on the radio is the battery, but you can't have one without the other. So the voice and the little red light are the emotions that we have, and yet it's so intimately, if I can use that word, connected to the sexual energy, which is the driving force of the universe and our bodies, and the whole reason we're even able to speak and think. So that was where I wanted to go with that. Please carry on.
I don't think Reich really cracked the code about cancer with his book either, although it contains a lot of interesting perspectives. I mean, that book was probably the reason for his downfall, in a sense, because
which one are we talking about?
The cancer biopathy.
Oh,
the cancer biopathy.
Mm-hmm.
Because of course, when you make knowledge claims about cancer and treatment for it, you will get resistance. You will have critics,
absolutely,
and rightly so. But I don't think you have a claim to have a cure for cancer.
No,
but,
and I don't think he was ever necessarily proven wrong in what he's saying, though, either. And that's the thing, we haven't found the cure for cancer. We don't know what it is yet. And we're completely still negating the role of life force or sexual energy in our bodies, and still think that, and as David was saying, to David's point, that it wasn't so much that Reich was the sex freak, it was the people that have the repression and fear about even talking about it. I mean, in Victorian ages, they were covering up piano legs and terrified of sexuality. So, we're on a continuum, and I think that his work hasn't been discredited nor proven yet, and is still very valid to a very repressed society today.
Another interesting aspect about that is about the life energy and the sexual energy, is that was actually a controversy between Sigmund Freud and Carl Gustav Jung, which had just happened before Reich came into the psychoanalytic circuits, and Freud thought that the energy drive that created neuroses was sexual in nature. So he called the energy a libido energy. And he said, it's not a life energy, it's a sexual energy.
Mm-hmm.
And Jung said, well, it's not just a sexual energy, it's a life energy. And that was part of the troubles between Freud and Jung. And Reich, of course, who was a pupil of Freud, he emphasized the sexual nature of the energy, even though he always was interested in the life energy aspect. His first paper was about the energy concept from Forel to Jung. So he was very knowledgeable about Jung's concept of life energy, even as a medical student. So he sort of emphasizes the sexual nature of this energy until he is more or less expelled from the psychoanalytic circuits, and then he starts moving in a more life energy direction.
And why was he expelled? Go into that, and like where his break with Freud happened, because he was Freud's youngest analyst in Vienna, originally having studied law and then moved into medicine. And then he was
expelled in 1934 because he was because he was a communist, basically.
Mhm.
It was too dangerous in
Well,
1933 and
because he was very,
1934.
very political, wouldn't you say? It wasn't exactly that he was a communist, but that he was drawing a political attention that they were not comfortable with.
Well, at the time, he was certainly a communist, and
Yeah.
later he became an equally fervent anti-communist. But at the time, he was a very active communist, and the psychoanalyst wanted to de-escalate the situation, so to speak.
Can I just add
the
something in
victim.
here and correct me if I'm wrong?
Mm.
So originally, the idea of his work being something that became political. I mean, let's just look at for a moment where his work was, because he actually had huge followings in all of that. And from what I understand, Freud and that whole group were already, considered pretty off the wall, fringe kind of people for what they were doing. Because it seems, and they were trying to establish their own psychoanalytic technique. And then Reich was not only doing that, but also getting more involved, because the more he sort of started seeing how what we're talking about with the mind was so directly related to the political sphere, that's where he started getting more political and politically involved. And that's where it started to feeling more dangerous for them. Would you say that that's correct, or am I misconstruing that?
No, it's basically correct. Freud was very upset about his younger pupils who were Marxist, like not only Reich, but Otto Fernichel, Erich Fromm, a lot of others. I mean, most of that generation were either socialists or communists of the second generation of analysts in Vienna and Berlin. So Freud wrote a very fierce critique of Marxism in 1932, and he said that if psychoanalysis is to be attacked, it should be attacked as psychoanalysis and not because it's connected in any way with communism, which is a reasonable standpoint. But on the other hand, it's noteworthy that the only book that warned against fascism and analyzed it through a Freudian lens came from Wilhelm Reich. So it says something about his courage too, even though he later thought he was politically naive at the time, which was probably also true.
So he wrote, so there's the function of the orgasm. There's many. There's also character analysis, which is still being used in psychoanalytical training, or at least it was when I heard about this. And
I think that is his main work, yes.
Yeah, main work
Character
in that.
analysis, yes.
And yet they're told, because he was adding other chapters to it as well, connecting the body, they're told not to read the parts about where it's connected to the body, because that's just a bit wacky, and really just stick to this first part of character analysis, because it's a really powerful treatise. Is that correct?
He expanded the book in later editions so that it was common to say at the time that only the first part of the book that was the original one from 1933 should be read, and skip the later add-ons. But those chapters are fascinating. Pardon?
Yeah, they're fascinating, and they're based in the psychology of the body, really, aren't they? Where you can really see that he's the father of psychodynamic mind-body connection.
Yes, absolutely. Those later chapters are the beginning of body psychotherapy.
And so that's another reason why his work is so prevalent today. If in psychoanalytic circles, he's being read, but then that whole part of where it's connected to the body is being discarded. Now, not everyone does that, but the fact that that's still in primary academic circles means that so much of his work really has not really hit the ground yet, where the rubbers hit the road, so to speak.
But that's exactly what I'm talking about, where there is a lot of common ground. That first 1933 character analysis, where he first posits about character defenses and and muscular defenses sort of being related, and naming them armor, and naming these chronic inhibitions as being sort of at the fundamental to understanding neurosis, and what the technique of analysis really is really dealing with, if there's going to be more than just an abstract verbal understanding of treatment. So he took psychoanalysis in the direction of the body, but they're just not comfortable with going farther than he did up to that point, even though it's reasonable to say that the direction, by taking it farther, he built on something on his own foundation in a very reasonable way.
And of profound interest. And as a somatic therapist, I have to say, if anyone's, it's a great book to read either way, but I think it's foundational reading. Those two books particularly, Function of the Orgasm and Character Analysis, if you're a bodywork therapist, because of how much it offers.
And I think it could be enlightening for people less familiar. Like when Reich talks about the function of the orgasm, he's talking about literally a fundamental mechanism in nature of tension, charge, discharge, relaxation.
A pattern.
Mechanical tension, energetic charge, energetic discharge, and then mechanical relaxation. Now, this does happen in the orgasm function, especially if it's actually able to function fully, but it happens in single cells when they build up a lot of tension and build up a lot of energetic charge and then split. And then the energy discharges and the mechanical tension dissipates. Or a bladder that fills up with fluid and builds up a lot of tension, mechanical tension and energetic charge, and then the mechanical tension goes away when the bladder empties. And so the function of the orgasm is not really about orgasms.
Exactly. It's about pattern.
Yeah.
And that pattern, and that a fractal is a pattern that repeats itself at different scales. So you can talk about the cell, you can talk about the orgasm, you can talk about the bladder, you can talk about weather systems and the spirals of weather systems that build up, charge, and then release. So he had his finger in so many pies, so to speak, because he understood the fundamental pattern. And so people would say, well, how can you know so much about these 10 different things? And it was because pattern thinking, which has always been in Eastern philosophies, actually, and was the basis of the medicine and the philosophy for thousands of years, and where it's finally beginning to be understood, is now found in the realm of physics in the form of fractals, and how chaos theory is the basis of understanding fractals, how tumor formation, which was never understood in the way blood formation would change when looked through a fractal lens, makes much more sense. So we're making huge advances now in science because we're finally being able to see underlying pattern. And that's, to me, why Reich was brilliant, because he understood underlying pattern, and everyone else was like, no, it's just a thing here and here and here. But he was like, no, it's all under here. And that's where I really take my hat off to him, because that was very progressive and still is today, and is just right now cracking the code, so much so that it really aids and abets understanding the unified field theory between relativity and the quantum world. So that's where it leads right into physics. But of course, there was a lot of controversy. And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, when he delved into natural science and explored those areas, he made himself an easy target of attack, and he could make mistakes that others experts in the field could point to. But I did find a fascinating part of the story. In Norway, there was a huge newspaper campaign about him, and he was stripped of scientific authority. And the reason was that an expert in physiology who had worked with him on these psychogalvanic skin measurements sort of said that he's not a serious scientist. He takes a bit from Freud and a bit from Marx and whatnot, and he doesn't have a clue about measuring skin potentials. And Reich had hired this guy because he was an expert in doing these measurements. And Reich's idea was that he wanted to do measurements at the psychiatric ward and see. His idea was that schizophrenics had pulled themselves energetically inwards, that they moved away from the world into themselves. So he thought, energetically speaking, they move inwards, and probably they will have lower energy on the skin than normal people. So we wanted to have a control group and measure what are the levels here. His idea was probably the schizophrenics will have lower skin potentials. And Hoffman, who was the physiologist, said we couldn't detect any such differences. So Reich was wrong. It was an interesting idea, but he was wrong. And it's not surprising because he's not an electrophysiologist. Now, this is a very well-known case in the history of Wilhelm Reich, but I wanted to see, did anyone ever check what's the current status in this scientific field? So I contacted an electrophysiologist at the University of Oslo, and he said, well, now we know that schizophrenics have lower skin potentials than normal people.
Right. Yeah.
And this wasn't discovered until in the 1950s in the United States. And the reason was very simple. The technology you had in 1934 wasn't good enough to measure such minute differences. But in the 1950s, wow, it's kind of interesting. Schizophrenics have consistently lower skin potentials than normal people. Now, what could the reason for that be? So I found that fascinating. It's like you say, his way of thinking is fascinating in itself, because sometimes he really hits the mark. Oftentimes.
And he didn't get that result, but there were other important results that he did get when he did the skin measurements, just in terms of seeing an electrical response that when there were feelings such as pleasure or anxiety, etc. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The results weren't accepted by the physiologist at the time, but yeah.
There's so many things. I'd like to go into the emotional plague. I'd like to go into a whole bunch of things, but I know that one thing, and we're already almost at an hour. I want to talk about the conference.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, right. See, I said we'd forget about that. And we have a raffle to do, of people. We've got 2 tickets that we're going to give away to the conference as well. And there is a discount code for anyone here. It's Reich 2024. If David, if you want to just punch that into the chat, REICH 2024. If you and the link to the conference. So if you don't win the raffle, you can still get $25 off. There's 2 different days. And so you can just do the one day and get that discount, or you can do the whole weekend. I certainly will be there myself. I'm also going to share a link. There's a summit that I did on science, orgasm, and spirituality with Barry Komisarek, who's one of the speakers in this. He is the Associate Dean of Psychology at Rutgers University and one of the foremost researchers in sexuality. He speaks about sexuality and orgasm so practically that it's both comical and soothing at the same time. And he will be one of the speakers in the conference. And I have a very well-known Tantra teacher, Michaela Boehm, who's in that, and Connie Huthsteiner, who's also part of this group of people that gather at the Rangeley conferences. So we talk about Reichian connections to sexuality and orgasm, and I will drop a link in about that. But I know that one thing that people really want to hear about is the orgone accumulator and why he ended up in jail. David, you mentioned that and said it would be good if we kind of swung back over to that. So do you want to go ahead and start that off?
Sure. I'm one of those people now that can't seem to figure out how to use their computer because it's not my usual computer and I can't get into the chat.
Oh, okay.
So I will just say, if you
I'll put it in. I'll put that in.
Yeah, our conference can be found at 2024.wilhelmreichmuseum.org.
It's actually the first link. It is the first link in, I already put it up in
That's
the
another
chat,
version
but I
of it.
will
Okay.
drop it in again here. And then the code for $25 off is Reich 20.
REICH 2024, Reich
Yeah.
2024.
There you go. For $25 off. Yeah. Okay. Hit it, David.
Okay, so to tell that story, so the as subsequent to Reich's study of origin of life and bions and his sort of work with microscopes and biology, he fashioned what's called a Faraday cage. He was sensing some radiation, something radiating, and he enclosed it in a metal cage in order to isolate it. And then he insulated the metal cage. And eventually he invented what became called the orgone energy accumulator, which was some kind of an enclosure that tends to concentrate this life energy toward the inside and create a kind of a field that would then interact with the field of something like an organism, a mouse or a human being or whatever the case may be, or a plant. A lot of different experiments were done. And it wasn't a mechanical device. It was an energetic device that would affect what interacted with it in different ways, depending on the function, the nature of the individual or that was inside. For example, so there's no set rule eventually he built orgone accumulators that you could sit in as a person. And there was no set rule. One person might feel a kind of a tingly charge immediately. Another person might sit in the accumulator 20 minutes a day for a month and start to feel something, or maybe not. It was an experimental device, but it was an experimental device that people really wanted to experiment with. Reich had a lot of physicians in training, and they had patients, and they became acquainted with the orgone accumulator at their doctor's offices, and they wanted to have them at home. And sometimes the doctors would want to prescribe them because the patient might actually benefit from charging up in an orgone accumulator. Now, there were no specific claims being made as to their efficacy, and Reich did not sell them. He loaned them out in exchange for something like a $10 a month donation for research. And this was happening in the 1940s and early 1950s, during which time American Medical Association, Psychiatric Association, people were noticing, people in the mainstream medical field were noticing that Reich was getting a certain amount of attention for this alternative approach to medicine. And the Food and Drug Administration at the time had recently acquired the power to regulate medical devices and things of that nature. And they had successfully stopped some quackery. There were magic belts that people were selling or, whatever. So Reich became a kind of a target for them to investigate. What is going on here? What is with this box? And why are so many people interested in this box? Now, were there that many people? No. At the peak, there were maybe a few hundred orgone accumulators in existence. This is the late 40s. The Food and Drug Administration spent millions of dollars in those days investigating this. And so they asked some scientists to look at the box. And, it was sort of a fait accompli that they would say, well, this is just a box. There's nothing to this. You can't plug it in. It doesn't do anything. And the Food and Drug Administration eventually went to court and asked for an injunction against the shipment in interstate commerce of orgone accumulators. Why? Not because they were harming people, because they could not find a single user of an orgone accumulator who had anything negative to say about them. Not because they're harming people, but because in the Food and Drug Administration's opinion, they might, the accumulator and the ideas behind the accumulator might prevent people from seeking real medical treatment that they might need. Now, in the injunction, they not only wanted accumulators to not be manufactured and distributed, but they wanted any literature that described the operation of the accumulator or even orgone energy itself to be destroyed or withheld from circulation. There were a few different things that went on. They considered some literature to be packaging, as if it were like the label on the outside of a box for a fake product. And that kind of literature had to be burned or destroyed. Other books that talked about orgone energy and how it might help you, maybe they said needed to be withheld from circulation until the words orgone energy were crossed out. You know, it was crazy. Now, the problem was Reich would have had a very good case if he had gone to court and said, well, the Food and Drug Administration doesn't know what it's talking about. And the books are, the accumulators not harming anybody, the books are not harming anybody, and this is censorship and all these things. Unfortunately, Reich didn't do that. He, as a matter of principle, simply ignored the complaint, did not go to court, did not defend himself, and put himself in a legally tenuous position, because the judge, with one side appearing, Food and Drug Administration, saying the people need to be protected from this. We want this injunction, and the other side not appearing to defend itself.
He had written a letter. He had written a letter saying, like, you have no right to even pull this into court, and I won't on principle come. So he'd written the letter, but the judge just dismissed it as him just not showing up.
The letter didn't meet the judge's definition of a legal response. And so it's not that Reich had nothing to say, but he didn't do the technically legal maneuvers that could have prevented a lot of the bad things that happened. And we have to remember, the bad things hadn't happened yet. All that had happened up to that point was the Food and Drug Administration had made a complaint. I don't think anyone would have thought that this would end up a few years later with Reich in prison. So he didn't go to court. The injunction was granted by default. Everything the Food and Drug Administration wanted, their dream injunction, was granted. So now Wilhelm Reich and the Wilhelm Reich Foundation and his associates could not ship accumulators, could not circulate certain books, could not do various things. So he said, okay, we won't do those things. And they were watching him like a hawk. And he went on about his business. And a few years later.
Although, wait, one moment, they did make him come with axes and different things and watched him while he destroyed his own accumulators in front of them, correct? There
was a destruction. There were some accumulators that were destroyed here at Organon, where I am.
Right. By him, by his own hand.
Yeah. But for example, the injunction called for all the accumulators that people were out in the world to be called back. Not a single one was. Everyone refused. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of people came to Reich's defense. All the doctors that were training with him, they tried to intervene in the case. They wrote affidavits. They hired lawyers. They said, the accumulator is important to our medical practice, and it would be malpractice for me to stop using the accumulator. No, but none of these arguments went anywhere. So, and this was later. It gets a little complicated. So the injunction was granted. He lived under it, but eventually it was violated by a Dr. Michael Silvert, who shipped some accumulators and books from Maine to New York, while Reich was in Arizona with his cloudbusters he had moved on to completely other areas of research. When this happened, Reich and Silvert were then charged with contempt of court, criminal contempt of court. Then there was a trial where Reich was not allowed to raise any of the defenses that he would have raised originally, because the trial was only about not the content of the injunction, but whether it had been violated. And he said, well, yes, of course I violated it. We know that. So, and then they made him an example of him. They went beyond what anybody would have expected in such a case and gave him a 2-year prison sentence and a fine. And Dr. Silvert, I think, a year and a day and all that. And he went to prison. His appeals were denied, even to the Supreme Court. And he went to prison, and his health was failing, and he died there. So it was a tragic sequence of legal entanglements that could not really have been predicted, that turned out about as badly as they could have. But all of this burning of books, yes, there were a lot of people in the government who had it in for Reich and wanted him stopped, not just in the government, in the medical associations and the psychiatric association, who were happy about the outcome. But the burning of the books was just a kind of a bizarre anomaly, more than direct censorship, in my view. It just never should have happened, but legally there was no way to stop it. And it was done because of this misunderstanding of the nature of orgone energy, and this false attribution of danger and quackery to the orgone energy accumulator, which wasn't harming anyone. And again, there was not a single complaint by a user of an orgone accumulator. This was all third parties, encouraging the government to just stop that guy, to stop him.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I know you obviously have orgone accumulators because you're there, and I know Hovar has one. I have one because it was given to me by a client many years ago who was moving, and his sister-in-law had cancer and was given, I don't remember how many months to live. I wrote the story down years ago. But he gave it to me while they were relocating and moving, and I still have it here in the room. And so she used that. She had less than a year to live, and was full of cancer. And she had gone through, I think, a quarter of the chemo that they had recommended and refused the rest. And they said, well, you really got a limited period of time. She sat in that accumulator, I think, for a good few hours a day, went back to the hospital. And I'm sorry that I can't remember how many weeks or months later. And the doctor came in. I mean, I heard this directly from my client, who's a lawyer and judicial guy. And he was the one who had found her the accumulator, because it was kind of her dying wish to give that a try. And so she had gone to the doctors. The doctor opened the file, looked at her, left the room, came back and said, you need to put your clothes on and go. She got very freaked out, thinking, they weren't giving her any information. Went back to my client, who was, in her family, and because of who he was and having the ability to contact and get information through hospitals and judicial courts and what have you, he called to find out what happened. And they said, well, actually, we just thought that we had the wrong file, because the file that was sitting in front of us and the woman who was sitting in front of us are different. There's no cancer in her body, but ash, where tumors disappear. But in fact, it is the right client and it is the right folio, and she's fine. And she lived for, I think it was another 16 years after that. So that's the story that came with my accumulator. Not to say that it cures cancer, but to say that there's obviously something intriguing and interesting. He was in conversation with Einstein about it, got into different discussions. So again, of course, there's so much to share about.
Well, you mentioned that I have one. I borrowed one many years ago. I don't actually have one as such, but I think Reich did some mistakes in this period of his life, that he changed his own books and inserted the orgone concepts into books he had written before he had coined any concept of the orgone. And I suppose part of the FDA's argument was that he used his former authority as a psychiatrist to propagate the orgone theory, which they thought was unconfirmed, and they were right about that. So,
but the theory in the book was not harming anyone.
no.
It was only to be withheld from distribution because supposedly he was peddling a fraudulent medical device. And if not for that mechanism, you had to define the accumulator as a medical device. It had to be a fraud. He had to be trying to profit from it by fooling people. And then you have to add to that, and therefore a book like The Sexual Revolution or something, where he mentions orgone energy, needs to be withheld from. I mean, it's a pretty far stretch that never would have
Absolutely.
survived if he had had a proper defense in court.
Mm-hmm.
He was definitely honest in his theoretical work. I mean, he wasn't a swindler in
Yeah.
any sense.
If he were, he could have been much more successful at it.
True. Okay, well, I'm gonna start the raffle part now. I know that in the conference is going to be the first weekend in August, on a Saturday and a Sunday, I believe it is.
Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
Friday, Saturday,
August
Sunday from 12 to
2.
4 Eastern time.
Right.
I lost connection earlier, but did you speak about the conference?
We didn't go into detail about it. I'm just kind of covering it briefly now. I'm gonna just sort of do, and so yes, Peter Reich is going to be there, who is Wilhelm Reich's son. He's never spoken, I believe, publicly, certainly not in this conference before. He's going to be the first speaker in that, which is very exciting. He wrote one of my favorite books ever, not just because of Reichian relations, but he talked about what it was like growing up with Reich and as a 13-year-old when a lot of this was going down. It's called A Book of Dreams. It's very hard to find. It's so beautiful, that book. And I
It's
really,
not hard to find anymore because
oh,
there's a new
good.
edition out.
Oh,
Paperback
great.
edition can be bought on
There are even
Amazon.
there are several translations of it that have been put out. Here's Peter from Bad Reflection, from the
Aw,
time when he was here with his father.
that's so great.
And
That's
that book inspired Kate Bush, the Kate Bush song Cloudbursting, and Patti Smith's song Birdland, and John Lennon's Out the Blue. And yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, absolutely. So there's a number of different speakers. There's the link there where people can go and take a look at the different speakers there. Hovar, I believe you're speaking at it as well, are you not?
No, Hobart is not, as
Oh,
far as
he's
we
not
know.
speaking this year. There's a lot of great speakers there. Please do check it out. It's a very interesting conference. I'm definitely taking the time off myself to do that. So we're going to run the raffle. We're giving away 2 free tickets. Don't forget that if you've watched this, the coupon code is Reich 2024, REICH 2024 on the link for the conference. Is that right, David, or should they contact you
Yes.
directly?
No, that is the discount code that they can use when they register to get
Okay.
a $25 discount.
Great. Yeah. And so I will share the question for the raffle. The first 2 people who answer the question correctly will win the ticket. So get ready. It's a bit of a quiz because we were discussing it. And then I'm going to share a little bit about the links that I put in there about what I offer. So the question is, name the book that was used and still is used when studying psychoanalysis that kind of really lays the groundwork of him being a body psychodynamic leader in the field that has had certain chapters taken out because it has to do more directly with the body work. And whoever the first 2
Answers are coming in.
Oh yeah, already. Roxana right off the top, and Sharon, you win.
Oh,
So I'm just going to share that the Science, Orgasm, and Spirituality Summit that I ran with those 3 speakers, Barry Commissar being one who's also going to be at the conference this year, that was always $97. It's now $19.95. I dropped it in honor of this whole conference going on. There's a link directly there, or geometryofhealing.com, my website. You can go to the store and you can find that there on the store if you want to see a kind of mini summit with 3 really great speakers around it. I offer retreats in southern France. My next retreat will be next June, and it's where we really go into the body and learn a lot about how to release aches and pains, pain syndromes, or just generally upgrade your health by working with a stretch reflex in a different way and understanding fractals and the nature of your own anatomy in relation to fractals. So I put that link in there. And I also teach weekly classes online. Every other Wednesday or Saturday that you can come live, ask questions about what's going on with your own body. And you can find all that information at geometryofhealing.com. So Roxana and Sharon, and replays are available. Yes. And I think that's about the conference. David, replays are available on the conference?
Yes, they will be.
Yeah. Great. Good. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And Sharon and Roxana, they get in touch with you directly, David, yes?
Yes.
For the,
Or you can just send me their email addresses and I can reach out to them.
I think it would
Either
probably
way.
better if you put your email address in right now, and then they can contact you directly, because I don't necessarily have their email addresses.
I can't get into the chat, but if you go to wilhelmreichmuseum.org,
Or just give me your email address. That's
you
best
can
for
use
that.
info
Yep.
at wilhelmreichmuseum.org. Just spell it carefully. WILHELMREICH museum.org. It will get to me.
Great. So our two winners can contact David there, and you have 2 free tickets, and I'll see you there. So we don't have a lot of time to get into any questions or answers. I'm really interested in actually running a book study on the function of the orgasm, so we can go through the book and have conversations. I'm really interested to know if anybody is interested in that. So if you are, please drop that in and let me know. And I would love to, if you're on my website, my list, which you would have to be to join, I think I'm going to send out a newsletter about that. And in future, I would really like to run a book study of function of the orgasm and in a perfect world character analysis as well. Great. I'm really glad everyone's into that. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming to share your wisdom. Really appreciate it.
Yes.
Very
And-
enjoyable. You're
Yeah.
welcome.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And we'll see you at the conference. Okay.
I found the chat.
Oh, great. There you go. You found it.
Actually, I'm kidding. Okay. Bye,
Okay.
everyone.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.